Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a subject that is both incredibly important and, frankly, very difficult.
It is.
We're going back to the early colonial Andes,
Yeah.
specifically that moment of profound social rupture right after the Spanish conquest of the Inca polity in the 1530s.
And this is really a deep dive into survival, into violence, and into how institutions change or are forcibly changed.
Exactly.
What makes this so pertinent, as you said, is the source stack we're working with. It's really rich, but also very challenging. We're trying to synthesize material that you almost never see put side by side.
Right, you've got these brutal 16th century chronicles.
Next to these very dry but, incredibly revealing legal petitions filed by Indigenous people themselves.
And then the science, the complex bioarchaeological reports that analyze human remains.
Yeah.
And that material, it contains some extraordinarily difficult truths about systemic violence, about exploitation. So our mission here isn't just to list off facts.
No.
It's to synthesize them. We're looking for what researchers call convergent testimony.
That's the key phrase.
It's that precise point where the bone, the law, and the historical text all meet and tell the same story. We want to understand, on a structural level, how gendered violence became institutionalized against Indigenous women.
And maybe most importantly, how they fought back, how they resisted and found ways to survive in this new world.
Yes.
To frame this, I think you have to recognize that the period from the 1530s onwards was just. It was one of immediate, brutal, and systematic rupture.
It wasn't slow.
Not at all. The evidence shows that the violence wasn't just a few bad actors committing sporadic acts. It moved so quickly from individual predation to institutionalized control. It was woven directly into the fabric of the colonial state's economic and social framework from the very beginning.
So that's the grim trajectory we need to trace.
Exactly. From the moment the Inca polity fell to the very first attempts by this new colonial state to organize and subjugate the population.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with that immediate, visceral impact. If we look at the chroniclers, the early legal testimonies, what stands out is just the speed and the brutality of the physical seizure of women.
Right out of their homes.
Yeah, this isn't an abstract idea. The sources are painfully specific.
They really are. We often think of conquest as these big battles, these grand political maneuvers. But the immediate social fallout, that hits the domestic sphere first.
The home.
Exactly. The sources describe scenes of just terrifying intimacy. A typical account, and you see this repeated across different depositions from the 1540s, it paints this picture. A woman is in her domestic compound. She is awake.
It's not happening in the dead of night, necessarily.
Not always, no. And then men, usually foreign soldiers, force open the reed partition or the small door. She's pulled by the arms, dragged into a foreign shelter or a military camp.
And the detail that always gets me, the one that makes it so real,
I think I know what you're going to say.
is that the accounts often note that her voice is cut off by a shout, and her children or her family are right there.
Outside listening.
Listening, and they're powerless to intervene.
That detail, the children listening, it just brings the violation right out of the history books and into this immediate personal sphere of terror. It shows the total stripping of autonomy.
It's not just an act of violence against one person. It's an act of terror against the entire family, the entire community.
Precisely. And this type of unadorned factual testimony appears again and again. It establishes this clear pattern of women being forcibly taken from their kin, from their households, and coerced into new living situations, usually for concubinage or for forced labor.
This wasn't incidental then. It was a core feature of that initial conquest period.
It was. And what's so remarkable is that the physical evidence, the archaeology, it completely corroborates the story of immediate domestic violation.
Okay, so what do the archaeological surveys of these Andean household compounds actually tell us? What does that moment of arrival look like in the dirt?
It looks like an abrupt interruption. Archaeological teams, especially those working in the Central Highlands and near sites like Huánuco Pampa, they've documented these stratigraphical layers, layers in the earth.
Right.
And they show these very clear, very sudden changes in domestic architecture. We see specialized Inca storage facilities, these things called colcas, suddenly emptied or just repurposed for something else entirely.
So the household economy is shattered.
Shattered. Domestic walls are abruptly torn down or hastily modified. And personal artifacts, like specific types of Inca ceramics, things people used every day, are displaced by new, much rougher material culture that's associated with the Spanish arrival.
So it's like finding a crime scene centuries later.
In a way, yes. It's physical proof found right there in the soil that is completely consistent with the arrival of new, non-indigenous male occupants who displaced and reorganized the entire existing domestic structure.
So the home is literally remade in the image of the conqueror. But beyond that physical seizure, what was the deeper sort of social consequence?
The consequence was the immediate catastrophic breakdown of the traditional kinship protection network. The whole social safety net in the Andes was built on these local networks, on reciprocity, they called it Hani, and the stability of the Ailu, the kin group.
The community.
Your community, exactly. When the Inca administration collapsed and the Spanish military rule took its place, that local protection just instantly evaporated.
And the chroniclers recorded this.
Oh, yes. Chroniclers like Pedro C. de Leon and Bernabe Cobo, they recorded not just the battles, but the sackings that followed and the quarantine measures that were put in place after military victories.
And those measures, I assume, directly targeted the most vulnerable people.
They always do. When the existing social structure fails, it's the most vulnerable populations who suffer first. In this context, it was Indigenous women who relied on those kin networks for communal labor, for reciprocity, for safety. They lose their primary source of security and are left completely exposed to this foreign military and settler presence.
That disruption of access to food, to shelter, to support, it sets the stage for everything that follows.
It immediately sets the stage for the institutionalized patterns of exploitation that came so quickly after.
Which brings us directly to the foundational economic system of the new colony, the encomienda.
Yeah.
This feels like the moment where those individual chaotic acts of violence begin to formalize into systemic policy, where people officially become commodities.
That's a perfect way to put it. The encomienda system was the mechanism of formalization. It's documented extensively in the Archivo General de Indias, the AGI, from the absolute earliest years of the conquest in the 1530s.
And these were grants, right, rewards for the conqueror.
Exactly, royal grants given as rewards.
Yeah.
And they formalized the distribution of indigenous labor and, critically, the distribution of indigenous people, including women, to Spanish colonists.
So to be clear, the system wasn't just giving them land, it was giving them effective ownership over the people living on it.
Absolutely. The official documents, they detail the obligations of tribute and labor. But if you read the primary sources, the letters from the conquistadors themselves, the royal appointment papers, the repartimento lists, they are chilling.
How so?
Because they reveal how Spanish officials viewed these people as units, as resources to be parceled out, just like you would parcel out livestock or mineral rights. The language is purely administrative, completely dehumanizing.
But hold on, the Spanish crown, at least on paper, had nominal laws. There was this pretense of a moral mission. How did the legal framework justify this? Was there any kind of protection built into the encomienda grant itself?
That is the crucial tension. The crown desperately wanted to project control and, Christian charity, but the economic reality on the ground just completely undermined it.
So what do the grants actually say?
They never explicitly said, you own these people. The language was more like, you are entrusted with their care and their Christianization, and in return, you may utilize their labor.
A convenient loophole.
A massive one. Because the encomendero, the grant holder, was the sole arbiter of what constituted care and how much labor was utilizable. And with the immense geographical distance from the crown, there was effectively zero accountability.
Total control.
Total control. And it was that total control over a person's labor that extended directly and inevitably to control over women's bodies, without question. That framework, treating human beings as resources, was the economic underpinning that enabled the whole catalog of abuses that figures like Bartolomé de las Casas documented.
Las Casas, his account from 1552 is just devastating.
It is. In his Brevissima Relation, he didn't just describe a few scattered instances of forced sexual access. He framed these abuses as the inevitable systemic consequence of this colonial resource distribution model. The system itself incentivized total, unregulated control over the people who were granted.
And in a patriarchal military culture, that of course means control over women's labor, their bodies, and their reproductive capacities.
Yeah, exactly. So the core insight here is that the colonial economy incentivized the sexual control. It wasn't just a byproduct of the conquest, it was a structural necessity for the encomendero's profit and power. It was the bedrock of the new extractive colonial economy. So once that initial phase of just raw violence subsided a bit and the encomienda system was in place, the conquest effort turned. It turned quickly to symbolic and institutional appropriation.
This started at the top.
Right at the top, with the seizure of the most powerful women in Inca society.
Let's focus on them, the Nustas, the high-status Inca women, especially after the capture of the capital, Cusco, in the 1530s. Their capture seems immediate, deliberate, highly symbolic.
Oh, it was calculated.
Yeah.
The seizure of elite Inca women was maybe the clearest symbolic act of conquering the entire Inca polity. These weren't just any women.
Yeah.
They held key positions in the Inca state. They managed complex textile production. They maintained royal lineages. They were instrumental in strategic alliances. By capturing them, the Spanish conquerors weren't just acquiring domestic servants.
They were taking the prestige. They were trying to symbolically castrate the former Inca identity and appropriate it for themselves.
Perfectly said. It was a power move, pure and simple.
And what specific sources detail this allocation of women?
Well, you have the chroniclers, of course, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, Cieza de Leon. They all record the appropriation of royal and high-status women. But crucially, we also have contemporary letters.
From the conquerors themselves.
It's from Francisco Pizarro and his captains, preserved in notarial records from the 1530s. And these letters, they list specific high-status women, often by their Inca names or ranks, who were formally allocated for concubinage or assigned to the households of Spanish captains.
It's all there in black and white.
It is. Pizarro's own alliances with Inca women, for example, are often framed as clever political strategy, and they were, but they also serve to legitimize the Spanish presence and, more importantly, set this powerful precedent for gendered control.
And again, the physical evidence backs this up. What did archaeologists find when they actually excavated these elite Inca palaces?
They found material evidence of a life that was just abruptly cut short. Excavations at elite Inca residential compounds, they show household inventories that were suddenly interrupted. Just stopped.
What kind of things?
Specialized, high-quality ceramics, and very significantly, textile production tools, spindles, looms, just left behind in layers that coincide exactly with the documented periods of sieges and capture events. The sudden, forced abandonment is crystal clear in the ground.
And the cost to the women themselves, the human cost.
If you examine the skeletal remains recovered from high-status tombs that were disturbed or relocated during this period, you often find evidence of trauma, of displacements that align perfectly with the textual records of forced relocation and the incredible stress of conquest.
So the consequence was twofold.
Yes, individual violation, of course, but also this very public, symbolic appropriation of Inca identity. It was designed to legitimize the new Spanish hierarchies, and it inevitably set a powerful cultural precedent for gendered control that then filtered down to every single social stratum.
And this cultural precedent, it leads us to the fate of the Aklas, the chosen women. This was a deeply important Inca institution that the Spanish just repurposed.
Immediately and ruthlessly. The Akalas were absolutely central to the Inca state. Before the conquest, these were highly specialized women housed in what were called akalahueses.
And their role was?
What?
Exactly.
It was multifaceted. They served crucial ritual purposes. They were responsible for producing the finest Quampi textiles. These were incredibly valuable textiles used for state gifts, for royal burials, and they also served as prestige brides in strategic political marriages. Their labor was central to the ideological and economic function of the entire Inca Empire.
So how did the Spanish see them?
As a high-value, pre-organized labor resource ready for the taking.
Of course.
Post-conquest records show the Aklas were immediately seized. They were baptized, often giving Christian names in these mass ceremonies, and then forced directly into Spanish household service. Ethnohistoric sources describe their presence at major Spanish sites like Cusco and Vilcabamba.
It's just a devastating example of how a pre-existing, highly structured female institution wasn't destroyed, but was actively co-opted and repurposed for colonial rule.
It's a classic colonial tactic.
So they kept their specialized skills, like weaving, but the entire purpose shifted from state ritual to colonial profit.
Precisely. Archaeologists excavating these former aklohuases have documented the continuity of textile specialization. The tools are there, the techniques are there, but there's a radical change in who's in control, in the output quotas, and where that output goes.
Their labor and their reproductive potential were completely redefined to serve the colonial power structure.
Entirely. providing domestic service and, crucially, reproducing the workforce. The seizure of the Eclalis was the colonial state demonstrating its ability to instantaneously seize the most valuable and highly organized women's institutions and use them for its own economic and status gain.
Okay, now let's move to the bodily costs of all this systemic stress. This is, to be honest, the most scientifically compelling piece of evidence we have for this kind of structural violence. The bioarchaeological evidence is just stark.
This is the material reality that you just can't argue away. We see these clear shifts in cemetery demographics near early colonial towns. We're talking about sites around Lima, around Cusco, and they show a measurable, significant increase in stress markers in female skeletons.
And specifically in skeletons dated to the early decades of colonial extraction.
To that exact period, yes.
So what exactly are these stress markers? What are we looking for in the bone?
We're talking about two primary indicators that tell a really clear story. First, something called cribra orbitalia.
Which is?
It manifests as porosity or little pits in the eye orbits, in the bone of the eye socket. It's a very strong indicator of chronic severe iron deficiency anemia.
Okay, and the second?
The second is called enamel hypoplasia. These are linear defects or grooves that you can see on the tooth enamel. They represent a period of nutritional or infectious stress that was suffered during childhood when the teeth were actually forming.
It's just chilling to think that the poverty and stress they endured is literally permanently etched into their skeletons.
It is.
But the key question is, why do we see these markers specifically increasing in female skeletons compared to male skeletons during this exact colonial period?
That is the critical question, and it's what the forensic teams had to meticulously figure out. They had to segment the cemetery layers to track these changes chronologically.
And what did they find?
The increase in these stress markers in women correlates directly with the early decades when men were being forcibly removed from their communities through the Mita labor drafts.
So the men are gone, sent to the mines.
And the women who are left behind suddenly have these vastly increased subsistence responsibilities. They have less access to high-quality foods like meat or specialized grains that men might have procured. And they suffered higher rates of chronic anemia, especially linked to reproductive stress and increased exposure to infectious diseases in these new, dense colonial settlements.
So the evidence suggests that the systemic collapse of the social safety net directly, physically impacted female health.
Measurably. And the isotopic analysis, that drives this point home even further. It shows you exactly what was stripped from their diet.
Explain that. What is isotopic analysis?
Right. It's a technique that measures stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes, specifically C13 and N15 that are found in the bone collagen. And what that does is it provides a definitive signature of a person's diet over their lifetime.
It's a chemical record of what they ate.
Permanent record. And studies on remains found near Trujillo and Cusco revealed these significant dietary shifts among women in the colonial period, especially when you compare them to the pre-conquest era.
What shifted? What did they stop eating?
Their diet showed a significant reduction in access to high-protein foods, specifically foods that were associated with prestige crops or sustained protein sources like camelids, llamas, and alpacas and coastal fish.
That's the good stuff.
The good stuff, exactly. The women's diets became much more reliant on lower-status, nitrogen-poor carbohydrates like maize. It's a clear sign of severe economic dispossession and relocation.
And this bioarchaeological marker, it links directly to the documents.
It correlates precisely with the documentary evidence of tribute and labor demands that stripped indigenous household of their resources. So what you have is material, measurable bodily stress, diminished health, and social marginalization, all traceable back to the violent reorganization of their society and their economy.
The structural violence is just.
Yeah.
It's undeniable, it's measurable in the bone, it's evident in the administrative records. And this chaos, it inevitably led to the Crown at least trying to regulate the conqueror's behavior.
Partly out of conscience, perhaps, but mostly out of a desire to control their new territory and, not have their entire workforce die out.
Right, a practical concern. So let's talk about the very first legal attempts at establishing some kind of control.
The Spanish crown definitely recognized the chaos. They saw the potential for demographic collapse to just ruin their new enterprises. So the laws of Burgos, which were passed between 1512 and 1513, so predating the fall of the Inca but applied immediately after, they were Spain's initial codification effort.
And they covered a lot of ground.
A lot. Christianization, labor quotas, and crucially for our discussion, they prescribed explicit protections for indigenous women and children.
What did those prescriptive protections actually say? What was on the books?
They contained some surprisingly detailed clauses. For instance, they mandated that indigenous people could not be overworked beyond specific limits. They required that masters provide adequate nutrition and rest. And they explicitly required that masters treat indigenous women humanely, avoiding abuse and forced cohabitation.
So the language is there.
The original royal ordinance language survives in legal compilations and correspondence. It showcases the Crown's intent to curb the worst excesses.
Intent, that's the key word. Because, as always in colonial history, there's this massive gap between the law on paper and the practice on the ground.
The gap was inherent to the system. While the royal ordinance language survived, local implementation was almost non-existent. Letters from royal officials, from missionaries, even from dissatisfied colonists, that preserved in the AGI, and they reveal these pervasive, intense disputes over enforcement.
The colonists just resisted.
Vehemently. They saw the labor and control of women as absolutely central to their profit model, and they fought any limitation.
So if a royal official tried to enforce a limit on labor or stop an instance of abuse, the local encomendero would just, what, ignore him, fight back.
Exactly. The law became a negotiation, not a rule. Local governors and judges were very often complicit with the powerful conquerors they were supposed to be regulating. They were all part of the same system.
So the result is a legal standard that really only existed on parchment.
Right. It resulted in this pervasive contradiction between what the distant crown demanded and what local, powerful Spanish practice permitted. The law was, at best, a bargaining tool for indigenous people. But more often than not, it was just an empty shield.
And we can even see this resistance to central control in the physical environment, can't we? Especially around the early mission sites.
Absolutely. Studies of early mission sites near these nascent colonial centers show a really complicated picture. While missions did sometimes offer a kind of refuge or minimal shelter for women seeking to escape a particularly brutal situation,
There was a catch.
there was a huge catch. They functioned primarily as centers of demographic control. The church and the civil authorities often enforced these resettlement processes, reducciones, that physically separated women from their traditional kin networks, even as they were supposedly moving into a place of safety.
So even seeking the protection of the church meant losing your existing community and your support system.
Correct. The stratigraphy and settlement patterns around sites near Lima and Arequipa show this sudden demographic reorganization in mission areas. It's consistent with forced resettlement and conversion programs. So the practical result of the laws of Burgos and these other regulations was often just the replacement of one form of social control with another, isolating women from the communal resources they desperately needed for survival.
And those contradictions just got deeper as the church rapidly inserted itself into regulating morality, specifically sexual relations after the conquest. They were essentially laying down a whole new moral and legal code.
The church was an incredibly powerful colonial actor, and it was quick to act on what it perceived as immorality. Missionary records, bishops' visitations from the 1530s to the 1560s, they show this active clerical involvement in not just baptisms, but in aggressively enforcing Christian marriage norms.
Which immediately put them in conflict with indigenous social norms.
A direct collision course. Indigenous societies often permitted various forms of polygyny or serial monogamy that were completely alien and sinful to the church.
So what does that conflict look like in the legal documents? What were people arguing about?
The ecclesiastical courts and the visitation records are just full of these complaints. They document what they call contested consensual status in matrimonial cases. Meaning you have cases where a Spanish man would claim a union was just consensual concubinage, and the woman, or maybe her family, would later argue she was coerced or was seeking to formalize the union to gain some kind of legal protection for herself and her children.
I see.
We also see high-ranking clergy recording these explicit complaints about cohabitation between settlers and indigenous women, and they were constantly trying to impose European definitions of legality and sin on these complex relationships.
So you have this clash between indigenous customary law, Spanish civil law, and Spanish canon law. It must have created an impossible legal maze for women to try and navigate.
An absolute maze. And the parish registers, which start to appear in the mid-16th century, are particularly revealing.
How so?
They show a clear spike in the baptisms of mixed ancestry children mestizos, and they document marriage proceedings that specifically record previous concubinage before the church finally sanctioned the union. This spike, it demonstrates the pervasive social reality of all these unsanctioned unions that were largely driven by exploitation.
And I imagine the burial patterns would reflect this new moral and legal authority as well.
Yes. The archaeological remains from churchyards that are adjacent to these colonial towns also reveal altered burial patterns for Indigenous women. It suggests both conversion to Christianity, but at the same time, this increased regulation and surveillance by the church. Women were caught. They were navigating these completely contradictory authorities. Their traditional protections were gone, and the new Spanish legal and ecclesiastical systems often treated them as moral subjects whose behavior needed constant correction and regulation.
So we've established the structural framework of violence, the encomienda, and the pretty ineffective nature of those early attempts at regulation.
Right.
Now, let's look at three massive interlocking factors that just compounded the vulnerability of Indigenous women: coerced labor, epidemic disease, and the pervasive military culture. Let's start with the total disruption of gendered labor divisions, specifically the mita.
The mita system and other forms of coerced labor known as repartimiento, this was the absolute backbone of colonial extraction. These labor drafts, which were meticulously documented in administrative rosters, systematically just, they shattered the traditional Indigenous gendered labor divisions.
And they took the men.
They took the men, often prime working-age men. They were sent hundreds of miles away to the silver mines at Potosi, for example, or to large-scale agricultural projects for months or even years at a time.
That fundamentally broke the economic balance of the household, didn't it?
Completely. Traditional Andean society relied on this reciprocal gender division of labor. It was a balance. Men focused on heavy agricultural labor, things like building terraces and external resource gathering.
And women?
Women managed domestic production, textile work, raising children, and often small-scale cultivation close to home. It was a partnership. But when the men were removed, the women were left behind, inheriting the men's heavy subsistence responsibilities on top of all their own traditional roles.
So what was the immediate social consequence of that depletion of men from the community?
It was twofold. Increased subsistence responsibilities coupled with a radical new vulnerability to outside predation.
Makes sense.
Ethnohistoric accounts from the period are crystal clear on this. Women were forced to take on new physically demanding burdens just to feed their families, and this simultaneously increased their exposure to colonial officials, tax collectors, local priests, soldiers. And at the same time, the absence of male protectors made them easy targets for sexual access and coercion by these same colonial outsiders.
Can we actually see this shifting labor burden materially in the archaeological record?
We can, yes. Archaeological surveys at Andean domestic sites show evidence of these shifting production strategies. There's a documented reduction in specialized household craft outputs, things like high-quality ceramics or complex textile production.
Because they just didn't have time.
They didn't have the time or the resources. Their labor shifted almost entirely toward immediate subsistence farming and food processing. We also see changes in storage facilities, which indicates a reduction in the ability to save resources for the long term. The household was weakened both economically and defensively, which just amplified the exposure of women to the colonial system's worst aspects.
Okay. Next, we have to address the devastating impact of epidemic disease. This acted as a massive multiplier for all this social dislocation, hitting the Andes in these recurring waves all through the 16th century.
The 16th century was a demographic apocalypse. There's no other word for it. Smallpox, measles, other introduced diseases. They were unbelievably lethal. Epidemiological reconstructions, mortality lists, bioarchaeological age profiles, they all show these staggering population declines.
How bad was it?
Upwards of 80 or even 90% in some regions. This was social collapse, not just high mortality. The entire society was breaking down.
And how did disease specifically increase the vulnerability of women on a structural level?
Disease shattered kinship groups overnight. The high mortality rates, particularly among adults, meant the sudden loss of male protectors, husbands, fathers, brothers, but also the loss of vital female support networks, mothers, sisters, aunts.
The whole community network is gone.
Gone. A single wave of epidemic disease could wipe out the male laborers in a village, leaving young widows or single women without any traditional or communal system of protection. This made them significantly more exposed to exploitation by encomenderos or soldiers who were looking for domestic labor or sexual access.
So disease facilitated the pattern of sexual dominance simply by eliminating the social infrastructure that might have resisted it.
Precisely. The skeletal data from mass graves confirms this. It often shows a demographic signature of social collapse alongside extremely high juvenile mortality, which demonstrates the fragility of the remaining social units. Disease didn't just kill, it fundamentally fractured the social systems that provided safety, making it that much easier for the existing systems of exploitation to operate completely unregulated.
And finally, let's look at the environment created by the Spanish military itself, the culture of garrison life, of conquest.
Right. Spanish military culture, particularly in those immediate post-conquest years, was incredibly volatile and largely unregulated by the central crown in Spain.
They were a long way from home.
A very long way. Muster rolls, pay lists, internal correspondence, they all show this transient, male-dominated environment. Governors were frequently writing back to the crown about chronic problems of discipline, desertion, looting, and, critically, the routine seizure of women, even long after formal battles had ceased.
So this means the violence wasn't only flowing from the established, settled encomenderos, but also from this rotating, temporary, and relatively uncontrolled military force.
Exactly. The presence of garrisons fundamentally shaped local dynamics. It led to this routinized violence and appropriation that happened completely outside of any formal economic or legal system. Even chroniclers who were sympathetic to the Spanish cause documented the soldiers' behavior in newly founded towns. They detailed instances where women were seized and forced into these temporary unions.
And we have physical confirmation of this aggressive spatial domination.
We do. Archaeological excavations of early colonial barracks or military staging areas, they show material evidence of these male-dominated foreign spaces being built immediately adjacent to indigenous quarters.
Right next door.
Right next door. And this spatial arrangement, this close, unregulated proximity, created routine opportunities for appropriation and violence, often outside of even the very limited formal legal sanction provided by the courts. The military environment, it essentially incubated the patterns of concubinage and informal forced unions that the legal and ecclesiastical systems later scrambled and often failed to manage.
The system we've outlined so far is just.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming, it's characterized by institutional violence, economic coercion, biological catastrophe.
It is.
And yet, the sources clearly show that indigenous women were not merely passive victims. They were actively navigating this perilous new reality.
Yes, and this is absolutely crucial to acknowledge. The agency that's demonstrated in the archives is incredible.
So let's look at how they sought redress, starting with the colonial courts.
Okay, so despite the massive systemic bias, the colonial courts, specifically the audiencia, which was the high court, and the municipal cabildos, they still represented a formal, if highly limited, avenue for redress.
A chance, at least.
A chance. And indigenous women, often leveraging the help of Spanish legal proxies or interpreters, filed petitions.
And what were they asking for in these petitions? What did they want?
The petitions, which are preserved in notarial and audiencia records across the Andes, they sought several key things. First, legal maintenance for themselves and their children. Second, the formalization of their unions into Christian marriage, which granted some legal protection. Or third, the punishment of abusers, including powerful encomenderos and soldiers.
But wasn't the deck just completely stacked against them? Indigenous testimony was often devalued, and the Spanish legal culture strongly prioritized property rights and status, Spanish property and status.
The bias was profound. It led to what we can call selective justice. Spanish law was fundamentally built to protect Spanish male property and honor. However, the system became a kind of market, a place where resources or protection or security could be obtained. It all depended on the status of the woman, her ability to mobilize her local kin networks, and, crucially, the specific political climate or the willingness of certain Spanish officials to hold their peers accountable.
So it was possible, but you had to play the game perfectly.
Yeah.
Could you give us an example of how a woman might successfully navigate this selective justice?
Sure. We have records where high-status indigenous women, leveraging their pre-conquest lineage or the fact that they bore children to a wealthy and influential Spanish man, were able to obtain significant settlements, or even compel the father to acknowledge the child and accept marriage.
So they used their status as leverage.
They did. These successful cases show that although it was deeply flawed, the legal system could be used strategically. And the disparities in outcomes heavily influenced how families strategized for protection, often favoring alliances with officials or church personnel to try and guarantee a favorable result.
And this tension, it leads directly to the rapid increase of mixed ancestry offspring, the mestis. While they were often born from these coercive unions, the mothers learned to leverage these children to create new social and legal claims.
The demographic shift is just unmistakable. The 16th and 17th century parish registers, the tribute lists, the censuses, they all show the scale of the increase in mixed ancestry offspring.
And the registers were specific.
Very. Church baptismal registers meticulously recorded the mother's indigenous status and often the father's Spanish origin. And researchers who have compiled these registers confirm that while many Spanish men fathered children with indigenous women, they overwhelmingly refused to grant them the legitimacy of marriage.
So the woman's reproductive labor, in a way, created a legal and social liability for the father. How did the mothers turn that liability into an advantage for their children?
Their reproductive labor produced tangible social claims. The notarial collections, these are records kept by public scribes, they contain legal petitions for legitimization and inheritance. These cases illuminate how mothers utilized the Spanish legal system, often naming the powerful father and his wealth, to secure material security for their children, even if they couldn't get a marriage.
That shows incredible agency and forward planning in a truly hostile environment. And did that legal outcome actually translate into a material difference for the children?
It did. The archaeological evidence confirms these variable outcomes. Studies of burial differentiation in grave goods show that mixed ancestry children whose mothers had successfully negotiated for paternal acknowledgement or support often received more Spanish or higher status goods in their graves compared to children who lacked those claims.
So maternal agency was fundamentally about leveraging the system to secure a viable future for your children within a social order that was designed to marginalize them.
That's it, exactly.
And beyond this individual recourse, there was also significant communal resistance to the structural abuses.
Absolutely. The colonial record preserves these powerful examples of indigenous communal petitions. These weren't individual women asking for a favor.
This was organized.
This was organized. Collective efforts, often led by local community leaders, the caciques, and written with the assistance of professional indigenous or Spanish interpreters. They documented collective resistance to abuses, and they cleverly combined Spanish legal arguments with appeals to their own deeply held pre-conquest rights and customs.
What did these collective resistance efforts look like on the ground?
A really notable example comes from the Ayacucho region. Communities there petitioned the Audiencia seeking restitution for groups of women who had been seized during military raids or taken by local encomenderos.
And what was their legal argument?
They argued that the loss of female labor threatened the community's very survival, and they demanded that the crown intervene based on its own existing royal laws. They were using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, so to speak.
Did the communities also organize physically to protect themselves?
Yes. The archaeological correlates show this practical resistance. We see evidence of communities reorganizing themselves, physically reestablishing communal compounds in more remote defensible areas, or changing their settlement patterns, specifically to shield women and children from outside predation.
It's a strategy of avoidance.
A strategy of survival.
Yeah.
It shows that indigenous agency manifested through both formal legal channels and these very practical spatial strategies of self-protection.
And finally, those micro-historical reconstructions, the individual dossiers, they really tell us that adaptation existed right alongside victimization.
They give us the granular reality of survival. We have documentation of individual women who sued for maintenance, who leveraged their kin networks, or who formed strategic alliances to compel Spanish men to provide dowries or accept marriage or just provide housing.
It's a story of negotiation.
Constant negotiation. These documents, corroborated by parish entries and witness testimonies, they show that while the systemic violence was overwhelming, individual acts of negotiation were sometimes effective in securing a better, if partial, outcome. These women, they understood the colonial system's weakness, its desire for legitimacy and stability, and they exploited those gaps for their own survival.
So as the initial chaos of the conquest era subsided, the colonial social order didn't just melt away, it stabilized. It became rigid, codified, and very long-lasting.
It calcified.
Exactly. By the 17th century, the systemic violence we've been talking about had calcified into these fixed, racialized caste categories.
And this is the bitter, enduring legacy of that initial systemic violence. The shift in the 17th century was from chaotic exploitation to institutionalized inequality. Legal categories like sangre limpia, pure blood, and the development of the casta painting system, they systematically annotated a person's status by their ancestry.
And that had real-world consequences.
Huge consequences. Parish registers and census records began annotating mestizo status in ways that directly affected property rights, legal mobility, and most certainly women's access to justice.
So the structural coercion, it didn't end. It just became a permanent feature of the state.
Exactly. This resulted in an institutionalized inequality that profoundly constrained women's life chances, their property rights, their legal protections, well into the Republican era for centuries.
And later reforms didn't fix it.
Even when later colonial decades, like the 18th century, saw some incremental reforms like changes in marriage law or the creation of charitable institutions like convents and hospitals offering refuge, these reforms rarely, if ever, fully remedied the structural coercion that was established during the preceding centuries.
And you can see that continuity in the archaeology.
Yes, the continuity of social hierarchy, which you can trace in the archaeological distributions of goods and housing in colonial towns, it reflects this long-term constraint on Indigenous women.
So let's pull it all together now. The power of this deep dive was really this promise of convergent testimony. When we look across all the disciplines, the texts, the law, the science, what is the final undeniable synthesis?
The documentation is just stark, it's cumulative, and it's cross-disciplinary. We're combining the moral outrage you find in Bartolomé de las Casas's 1552 account
with the meticulous legal details of Gabino Cervain's notarial series,
the historical context of Inca Garcilaso's commentary on appropriation,
and the hard scientific data.
And when you put it all together,
what's the conclusion? When the science meets the text,
the convergence proves that systematic dispossession, the forced implementation of coerced labor systems like the Mita, and frequent sexual violence were not isolated acts of misconduct. They were structural features of early colonial Andean society.
built into the system.
They were built into the economic and military infrastructure of the new state. And this left measurable, enduring material scars in bone, in trauma markers, in isotopic dietary stress, and in the legal record detailing women's desperate attempts to secure some kind of protection. This was systemic harm, written into the very bodies of the survivors.
Which brings us to the ethical task today. How do we remember and acknowledge this history, particularly when we're dealing with evidence as sensitive as human remains and documents detailing sexual violence?
Well, contemporary efforts, whether it's through repatriation campaigns, museum exhibits, or community-led memorials, they're drawing directly on this complex evidence to acknowledge these colonial wrongs. This historical record is now being cited as a justification for restitution.
But the ethical complexity is enormous.
It is. Public history projects and curatorial guidelines, they all stress this tension. How do you display bones or legal documents detailing sexual violence without re-traumatizing descendant communities who are still struggling with the legacies of this systemic harm?
That sensitivity has to be the absolute first requirement?
It has to be. Community consultation insists that descendant voices must shape the interpretation of this material. The ethical task is to assemble the evidence unflinchingly, to remember with honesty, and critically, to support descendant communities' own claims to commemoration and restitution.
The goal isn't just to state facts.
No, the goal is to acknowledge the bitter truth that the erosion of bodily autonomy and social protection was a structural harm with devastating consequences that have echoed across generations.
This history is incredibly difficult, but understanding its systematic, its structural nature, it's crucial for understanding the enduring inequalities that we still see in the Andes today. This deep dive has provided not just facts, but a comprehensive cross-disciplinary view of a long-term harm.
It is impossible to walk away from this material without recognizing the enduring intelligence and resilience it required just to survive it.
Yeah.
The central, bitter truth is clear. The violence against Indigenous women wasn't merely collateral damage of the conquest. It was a fundamental structural component that was necessary for the colonial economy to function and for Spanish power to be cemented.
So, as you process this history, consider this final provocative question for a moment. We've seen how institutions like the church and the courts attempted some partial regulation, while these powerful economic and structural incentives just drove abuse. What historical systems in the modern world demonstrate a similar tension, where moral or legal ideals are undermined by economic or structural incentives, leaving specific vulnerable populations exposed.
Think about that tension, that constant push and pull between a stated moral principle and the overwhelming drive of profit or power. It's something to carry forward from this deep dive.
Thank you for joining us for this essential conversation on the deep dive.
We hope you continue to explore this history and its deep resonance.